The body, obviously composed of what we can divide into different systems. But one of the principles of osteopathy is that it's all one, right? Not just physically it's all one, but including someone's emotional life, mental life, spiritual life. Like that's all part of one event. But it does help to talk about individual systems so we can begin to understand things. Now the connective tissue system, talking about ligaments and fascia, that creates this balance of tension, like here. And the principle it operates under is tensegrity, meaning that if you change any element of that system, the whole system is changed to some extent. The tension and position of the whole system is altered, even just a little bit there. So when we're looking at a joint, for instance, a joint is guided by ligaments. They check the motion of the joints. And then the bigger context for the joint is created through the fascia, because the fascia will also anchor into the bones, blend into ligaments in certain locations. So you have a local effect of the ligaments, but you have this global effect influencing the joint as well. So you'll have that global influence as well. Now when we have an injury or we have like a repetitive motion trauma, the balance of tension in the ligaments and the fascia changes. Again, we can use this example where this sits in the same position generally. So you can see here when the purple and yellow ones are parallel to the ground, the blue and orange ones are not vertical anymore. When I first got this, they were vertical. They were like that. But it's been sitting in one location, so they've tipped. It's been sitting, I think, probably like this. It's been sitting like that. So some elements have been overstretched until the ones that haven't been stretched, their tension then changes the neutral position. So this is just a perfect model for it, because you think about like an ankle sprain. What happens to someone who sprained their ankle? Is it easier for them to sprain it again? Yeah, it's easier. Like they'll sprain it doing nothing. The first time they sprain it, it's like some intense activity. But then they may just be jogging and they hit the ground wrong and it sprains. And that's because after that first injury, the balance of tension changed. So the neutral position of the joint shifted. So the actual location of the bones relative to each other at rest is now different. Now, most people's knee-jerk reaction to this is, okay, let me take it where it should go. If the ankle, let's say, right ankle here, and I'm holding the heel, if the ankle's kind of shifted this way, the toes are that direction, the outside is stretched, and the inside's relatively shorter, well, then we should stretch out the inside. The issue with that is this is abnormal, right? This tension over here is normal. So are we going to take the normal and make it abnormal, and that's going to make a normal ankle? Generally, no. That makes an unstable ankle. The key is acceptance. It's kind of interesting because these principles that we see operating like in emotional work, psychology for instance, we find they also apply to the physical body. So emotionally, if we resist something, then the problem continues. It kind of gets stuck. But if we accept it, and we are mindful of the content that's present, and we let it be how it is, acknowledging that it's impermanent and it's going to change, well then the emotion can move through and it can work itself out. The same thing is true with this type of work. If instead of trying to forcefully reestablish a new neutral, we find the neutral, we find balanced tension in the ligaments, and at that position, that's where the body, to the practitioner, begins to feel fluid. So it's like, instead of looking for the problem, we want to look for the health. And that's a term that's been used and developed. Andrew Taylor Still, the founder of osteopathy, really was probably the first to use that idea. But this school of thought within osteopathy called biodynamics of osteopathy in the cranial field, they focus on that a lot, where sometimes we can make the mistake of looking for the problem, especially in the beginning. We want to find a problem so that we can solve it. But it's better if we actually find the solution. And part of the solution is the wholeness of the body. So this fits right into the 4 principles of osteopathy, because you have, body, mind, spirit are one. The body has a self-healing mechanism. Structure and function are interrelated. Appropriate treatment flows from understanding the 3 previous principles. So there, if we understand the body as a whole, well, if we're palpating something and it feels separate from the whole, when we palpate it, we don't feel the whole vitality. Well, then our fine-tuning of position, like we're fine-tuning a radio, we're fine-tuning it to feel that wholeness. And in biodynamics of osteopathy in the cranial field, that's described as feeling the fluid body. So instead of going in and trying to find bind and, kind of even indirect sometimes can be where we go towards ease, a lot of times that's exaggerating something. And so it's still keeping things kind of separate, and it's not trying to find that feeling of health present in the tissues at that moment. It's like trying to force a reaction from the body. But if we go to that point where we're feeling the reestablishing of it just feeling like fluid, that's where the body releases from, in that neutral state. So when we get it there, it feels really cool. It feels flowing. Generally, our mind state, in order to allow it to go there, to facilitate it moving there. And I'm using those words instead of taking it there, because we have to be in neutral. We don't know where there is. We have to be in this continual loop of perception, and then we apply some generally very mild force. In that sort of, I'd say it's a sort of unity where the provider and the patient, something additional is present, where it's not just coming from the patient, it's not just coming from the provider. And this in biodynamics is referred to as the 3rd principle. So from that balance, from that neutral that comes out of listening and comes out of ease, following the position of ease, the flow returns, this fluid nature becomes apparent and present, and then the inherent rhythms, amplitude increase. So we're all familiar with some of the inherent rhythms, the heart rate, the respiratory rate. One of the lesser known inherent rhythms that's been established, as far as I'm concerned, it's been completely established, is, we call it the cranial rhythmic impulse. Now, this is an impulse that can be palpated anywhere in the body, and it's synchronous with an autonomic phenomena called the Traub-Herring-Mayer wave. Did you study this one in school at all?
No, we haven't studied.
Okay, so this isn't an unusual thing. This you'll find in a physiology textbook. You get Guyton and Hall. You can go to the index and look for Traub-Herring-Mayer, and you'll find a page on it. This is mainstream. There are these oscillations in autonomic input, and it shows up as changes in heart rate variability. Right? So in the 2 halves of the autonomic system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. When the parasympathetic system is relatively more dominant, beat-to-beat variability, meaning the time between heartbeats, changes more. There's more variability in the heart rate over time. When the sympathetic system is relatively dominant, there's less variability. And this measurement, heart rate variability, can actually determine the risk of reinfarcting after a heart attack. So we did a study in osteopathy where we had osteopaths palpating the cranium of a person who was hooked up, and their Traub-Herring-Mayer wave was being monitored by a blood flowmetry device attached to their ear. And what we were finding is that we are calling out these phases of that motion synchronously with the Traub-Herring-Mayer wave. So the motions that we are palpating, this very deep inherent rhythm, which we also call primary respiration, or the primary respiratory mechanism, and even more poetically, some of the early osteopaths coined the term the breath of life. And it's thought to be deeper than breathing. It's actually controlling the rate of breathing. Right? We know the autonomic system controls the rate of breathing. So when we're palpating that rhythm, one, the act of calming down and being still in order to feel it, that really brings our mind to focus. And so if we're palpating that rhythm, we are in this state that's very clear, that's very present. And so when we find that neutral, when we find that balance, we can actually get to that balance by first palpating the rhythm. And just, if we're feeling it and we're not clamping down on it, but we're just looking to let it flow, like let it do its thing, and pay attention to which range of its motion is easier, depending on what part of the body, that'll determine how it's moving in that part of the body. And that's part of the study of osteopathy, is learning how does that motion show up in different parts of the body. Well, then its ease of motion guides us into neutral, and then we get it neutral, this fluid state becomes very apparent, and the amplitude of that primary respiration becomes stronger, and it'll generally, before becoming stronger, it'll usually hit a still point where it'll stop. Like everything is balancing around this fulcrum, and the fulcrum is the trauma. So it's important to not get too attached to following the motion of primary respiration, because the still point is fantastic. When it hits a still point, we ideally don't want to be feeling like, oh, I wish it was moving again. You know, oh, I lost it. We should expect that it hits a still point. And in this study where they looked at the Traub-Herring-Mayer wave and how osteopaths call out the motion, this inherent motion, they actually also were able to call out the still points of when it stopped. Like a little bit of a tangent. This motion is minor. It's been measured on MRIs. And we can see, one, the head changes shape moment by moment, because all they had to do was do MRI, 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 MRI of the same slice of the brain. And they show there's this term called the ferret, the longest distance inside of an object. It changed over time. And then we also showed that, well, the amplitude of this motion, which ends up being in the micrometer range, like somewhere around 70 to 90 micrometers, and it can get a little bit, it can get higher than that. I think it approaches a fraction of a millimeter at its greatest amplitude. Well, there was another study done looking at this, people's ability to palpate changes in shape. And a device was created, a mechanical device that could move all the way down to, I think it was in the micrometers. I don't recall if it went below 15 micrometers. I think it did. I think it went down to like 5 or 10 micrometers. But what the result of the study was that, well, untrained humans, not osteopaths only, but untrained people could feel down to 15 micrometers of motion with statistical significance. They couldn't feel it every time, but it was more than random that they called out feeling when it moved. So basically they would, they'd say, okay, say whenever you feel it move. And then, so sometimes they would say they felt it move when it didn't. Sometimes they wouldn't say they did when it did move. But overall, they said when it moved much more consistently than could be explained by them, just randomly saying. So that still point, it's like the system is reorganizing, like it's shut down and it's rebooting. And frequently, in my experience, when people are on the table, especially when we're treating the head, but it can happen in other regions, if it's very deep and it's like an old dysfunction and it's just really come to this fantastic balance, because I'm out of the way, like I'm not coming with my agenda, but I'm really listening and like the body is leading, then they'll go to sleep. Like at a still point where the patient will also fall asleep, and then it'll, sometimes it'll hang out there for a while, but eventually it'll start moving again, and then it may unwind a bit, like something released and now it's over here, and then it may hit another still point, and then it may, do a little bit of unwinding, or maybe it's just a single one, and then it just goes back through neutral and then kind of returns. So when it releases, basically the thing that was pulling it off center in order to achieve neutral, that like falls away. And so the normal tension in the system brings it back. So it's not actually the physician that is saying, okay, now this is where you need to be. It is the wisdom inherent in the body. And so that's in line with one of the principles. The body has the ability to heal itself. So it's, philosophically, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because you look at like, all right, well, why does the body's ability to heal itself? Why do we need an osteopath? Why is there any benefit? Well, from my perspective, philosophically, we're like one organism. Just like within our body, it's a single event, it's one thing. Well, the human race is one thing. Like, we cannot exist with a single human, by definition. Like, we all depend upon parents at minimum, but then all food, you know, to thrive and survive. We're a single organism that's forgotten that, certainly, or maybe hasn't learned it fully. You look at even like more primitive primates, they required each other to help pick off bugs. Yeah. So that's almost, this comes from, I first read this in a book by a Scottish osteopath, in The Art of Listening, where he points that out. Like, this sort of work is kind of the evolution of that, this interdependency on each other. So by acknowledging that, and by acknowledging our role as being not the authoritative role of I'm fixing this, it's very much more like we have the privilege of witnessing the activity of this kind of dazzling, beautiful, indescribable force. And that's the experience of it is blissful when you're in the state to interact with these forces to balance it. It's a meditative state, and that's one way of applying it, that most people, the longer they do it, they move towards that way, because all of the other ways funnel into it, because if you stick with any of the other ways, they create physical problems for the practitioner that will either get them to stop doing it or cause some injury that keeps them from doing it. So the only way to, it seems like, to do it super efficiently is to gradually move towards this way where it's less and less the provider telling the body what to do, and it's more and more the provider being a sort of facilitator of what the body's already trying to do.
Pretty cool.
Isn't that fun? I mean, I love talking about it. If you read any of Andrew Taylor Still's works, he gets so poetic about it. He's like the laws that are employed in osteopathy are as old as the universe itself. He has all these very lofty ways of speaking, which, you know, it makes sense, because when you're working with these forces, like you're working with very close to this mystery of life. Like, what are we? I mean, where do we come from? What's the nature of consciousness? I think there's just so many questions that we probably won't ever be able to answer, because the idea of an answer is kind of itself making assumptions. It's saying that the question is valid, that we understand enough to say that, like, the world in which we're asking this question, that how we think the world is, we're saying that we know that that world is true, and so the question that comes out of that worldview is actually a true question. Probably there's not really answers to that mystery. It's more of a direct experience that can't really be translated into words.